Welcome to the Unlist. Today we're going to talk about a genre that sort of sits next to the fougere called the Chypre. Now, it's a really difficult word for us Americans, us Anglophiles who don't know any other language besides English to say. So you can try and do that little thing at the end of sheep, or you can just say sheep, which if you say just sheep by itself, it kind of sounds like you're saying the animal sheep. I don't really care, honestly. I also say sheep interchangeably with sheep or sheep, so I don't always do the little per spookus thing at the end. But anyway, the genre of sheep is a very versatile genre, a little different from the fougere genre, in a sense that whereas fougères all sort of inevitably share the same basic structure, which you know is that lavender, coumarin, oak moss, geranium, some kind of citrus, usually bergamot or lemon up top, and you get that fern accord. The sheep, which is sort of its equal opposite, is not really about a structure. It's more about a place. It's more about an aesthetic. And it's at once more versatile because you can do more with it, but it's also more primitive. As in, the things that define a sheep are not so much the smell or the structure of its composition, but the materials used to create the vibe that a sheep is supposed to have. So the word Chypre is French for Cyprus, and I don't mean the plant, I mean the island of Cyprus. And it's one of those things where the actual origin of the smell is much older than the smell itself, and you can date the sheep style going back several hundreds of years. It's because inhabitants of the island would take different things and combine them together and create scented oils that would then become a part of their culture. So like the sheep accord really focuses on things like labdanum, which comes from the flower rock rose that grows on that island. And then of course bergamot, because citrus grows on Cyprus as well. And then usually they would also put ambergris. They would find that lying on the beach. And so the general vibe of a sheep is to have this sort of salty, oceanic, but also musky, but also dry, fresh sort of smell that then kind of implies the windswept coastlines of the region, the plants, the garrigue, if you will, which is another French word for the things that grow on like the hillsides of the island. So basically, that vibe, that aesthetic, would become the sheep accord, which would then eventually evolve as modern perfumery evolved into the sheep genre of fragrances. The earliest ones in French perfumery were actually a lot darker and heavier than you might suspect, and I think that might have something to do with the limitations of the materials they had at that time. They didn't have synthetics, they didn't have a lot of buzzy acetates and ionones and things to play around with. They didn't have a lot of citrus distillates that they could use, or patchouli isolates and all that fun stuff. We can now make some really interesting stuff with this genre that they just couldn't do back then. So instead they went the opposite direction, where more is more is more is more. And they would just stuff more ingredients and build bigger, heavier, denser, more opaque accords. So like stuff like Chypre de Coty, which is like the first one that most people credit. There are older examples, but that's the one that really set the structure. And the same with that Fougère Royale was the first proper fougère. I've got a drink, by the way. I don't care if it's on camera or not. I'm not supporting the brand, I'm just thirsty. So the thing about that is you have Chypre de Coty, which kind of set the example. And then other perfumers in and around Francois Coty at that time would take that and play around with it, do something with it. So you would see a more like aldehyde take on it with a Quelques Fleurs, which is another Hubergat fragrance, unsurprisingly. Then you would see stuff like Chanel No. 5, which is also a built-up of that, much more aldehydes, much more florals, more musk going on. And then, of course, another famous example is Mitsoko. Mitsoko, created by Jacques Guerlain for House Guerlain. Mitsoko is, in some people's eyes, an improvement of Chypre de Coty, because Mitsoko is the first semi-transparent, more fresh, more floral. It's the first really archetype of the modern sheep that we know now, you know, where it went with more fruity floral tones. It used lactones to give you like a peach essence up top, and just the way it handled everything was much brighter, much more watercolor in nature compared to Chypre de Coty. Now, the fougere genre was really the provenance of men for a long time, just because of the wet shaving associations, barbershops, and such. Conversely speaking, the Chypre kind of remained mostly in the land of women, just because it's more versatile and you can build up from the Chypre accord, you can build up from the base, and you can build entire adjacent genres out of it. Because, you know, arpege, number 5, these were considered aldehyde florals, correct? They weren't necessarily considered Chypres, even though they are. And it's because they focus on allopathic aldehydes, stuff like that. And they focus on things like tuberose, rose, and all these other really heavy floral accords. Then you would see leather fragrances begin to emerge, and they would also be based on the Chypre accord. You see things like Nietzsche 10 by Joseph Nietzsche, and then you would see things like a little later on, you would get Miss Dior, you would get Bondy by Robert Piguet, you would get, what else? At that time, you would see green, very green, arboreal type of Chypres come out, like Von Vert, which I did a video on a while back. You would just, in general, you would find that the Chypre accord, the Chypre genre, would become a sort of a keystone to spread out into other areas that would end up becoming genres of their own, but also would have Chypre appended. So, you know, aldehyde floral Chypre, leather Chypre, aromatic, citrus aromatic Chypre. This is where men come into the play here, because men actually liked the citrus aromatics. Men were wearing stuff like Chevalier d'Orsay, which was technically predates Chypre de Coty. You could call it a proto-Chypre if you want to get really fancy pants. I don't care. They also liked stuff like Le Gallienne for gentlemen. They liked Moustache, just kind of sits in between Chypre and fougere, really. That was a little bit in the middle of the road. And then, of course, into the 50s, you see the citrus aromatic Chypre gain a little more speed, because you would see brands like Chanel come out with Pour Monsieur. You would see Monsieur de Givenchy. Then into the 60s, Monsieur Lanvin would come out, and just would continue on that. You know, Roberto Capucci would make Capucci Pour Homme. And it just, the whole citrus aromatic Chypre is probably the most fundamental. It's the most to the point. If you really want that smells like the island of Cyprus, if you really want the true to definition Chypre experience, then you actually want those citrus aromatics, because they dispense with the flowers, they dispense with the heavy patchouli, they dispense with the animalic musks for the most part. They might have civet in them a little bit. You know, Moustache has some civet, Monsieur Lanvin has some civet, etc., etc. Roberto Capucci's Capucci Pour Homme actually was more of a leather base. Even if it doesn't really smell like a leather fragrance or feel like one, it had a lot of isobutyquinoline in the base, that mousse de saxe kind of vibe a little bit. But I would still consider it citrus aromatic before I would call it leather, just due to the overall vibe. But those are going to be the most academic examples, and they would continue into the 70s and 80s. And those would actually become the provenance of men. Those were the Chypres that men would enjoy wearing. Women would continue wearing the aldehyde florals. They would continue wearing some of the leathers. They would continue with the more classic examples, like Youth Do is another classic genre exercise. And then Opium, which started to put some more what they call oriental elements in there with the sandalwood and stuff. But the spices. But the men would really stick with the aromatic citrus take on the Chypre, and then the Italians would start getting their hands in it. And once the Italians got their hands in it, I mean, Roberto Capucci was Italian too, but like it became more mainstream in Italy. You would see stuff like Armani Eau Pour Homme. You would see Gianfranco Ferré for men. You would see Fendi Uomo. Gucci had an early one in '76 with Gucci Pour Homme. That's considered a Chypre, I believe. I mean, some folks want to call that fougere too. I don't. Doesn't have enough fougere qualities, in my opinion, to qualify. Other ones that kind of ride middle of the road are like Balenciaga, Hohang. It's sort of both. Probably a little more fougere, though, honestly, with the lavender and such in it. But that's my point. The point is, the Chypre, unlike the fougere, can be built up in such a way that it doesn't really register as a Chypre anymore. It can become sort of unrecognizable to its origin. Because you get really far down the rabbit hole with the florals, for example. You get really heavy into the aldehydes. You move past stuff like number 5, you're getting stuff like Kalash, you're getting stuff like, if we're doing some Avon, stuff like Topaz is another one, and then of course Charlie was a big one. Then you see a lot of them get really heavy on the fruity floral notes, and things like Fiji and Y and Cristal and Silences and all of that stuff. And then you go further into the rose and the leathery notes and the patchouli, and suddenly we're in the territory of Diva by Ungaro, we're in Paloma Picasso, we're in, Catherine Deneuve, the original Armani scent, Montana Parfum de Peau. You get my point, right? And all of those are also descendants, are children of the Chypre Accord, all of them. So you look at the entire swath, and it gets pretty daunting after a while, pretty diverse. Since like everything from Sheep de Cody and Mitsoku, and then you start going to Paul Monsieur, Kalash, Roberto Capucci, you start getting into the muskier stuff and the green stuff, Volver, and then into the 80s, even Estee Lauder Beautiful, a private collection, or Azure. Those are all Chypres, every single one of them, all of them are. The Chypre genre kind of dominated, I mean, if you weren't making a fougere, right? If you weren't making a fougere, then you were making a Chypre or some descendant of a Chypre. So it's fair to say that the genre dominated most of the Western perfume world for probably the better part of maybe not quite a century, but, for most of the 20th century, it did dominate. And it's just because of how versatile it is. It's how you can do it like you do a hot rod, a car you modify, change it, make it the way you want. And the Chypre Accord being such versatile base accord material for perfumers to build up upon, they just didn't really see the need to do anything else. And then, of course, you know what happens. If you have a fragrance genre that's based entirely around natural materials that become harder and harder to source as the world gets depleted with population growth and all that dystopian stuff. And then, of course, the prices go up on those materials. And then, of course, you get regulations and IFRA and the European Cosmetics Commission and all that stuff. Next thing you know, okay, you can't use oak moss anymore. Sandalwood is too rare and expensive. It's been over-harvested up. Now you can't really use labdanum either. So the thing that really killed the Chypre, what made way for the more abstract perfumes we have now, made way for the aquatics, made way for the fruit choulis, for the really true fruity florals. Not stuff like Cristal or Fiji, but the really abstract fruity florals like Coco Mademoiselle, stuff like that. What paved the way for all of those fragrances, the candy rose water stuff, all that stuff, was the fact that the Chypre genre became untenable in the mainstream. Yeah, indie perfumers can still get Mysore sandalwood. Indie perfumers can still get oak moss. They can do what they want. They're not being washed over. But at the same time, they also can't distribute their fragrances very widely either because of those regulations. They can still do it. They can do the genre exercises. They can do the retro stuff. But for the mainstream, they had to look for alternatives, and that's when you started seeing the aquatics and all the other stuff begin to pop up, the ozonic fragrances, the gourmands, etc. I don't need to tell you. You guys already know. You see what's out there at counters now, right? So the Chypre was kind of hitting the ropes a little bit. It was getting, rope-a-doped like Muhammad Ali beating on his opponent. It was getting done dirty. But these days, modern times, it's starting to come back a little bit just because we finally found, and this is not going to be something that the vintage gatekeepers are going to like to hear. Okay, so if you're one of those types, you probably want to bow out now. But, we're starting to get to a point where there are at least decent replacement materials for oak moss, for sandalwood, or filtered, rectified versions of materials like the bergamot, the rectified bergamot, labdanum substitutes. Right now, people are doing things with lentiscus to replace oak moss, especially Guerlain's doing that, making really good reconstructions of some of these older fragrances that smell better than they actually have smelled for quite a long time. Reformulations that actually improve on past ones. That's a good sign, right? Again, purists don't want to hear that. Purists don't like that. They want the old. They never want to leave their little tinfoil hat layers, surrounded by empty pizza boxes and piles of Mountain Dew cans or whatever. That's fine. You can live that life. I'm not going to judge you. I am going to judge you, but who am I, right? It doesn't matter what I think. So the sheep genre has had something of a resurgence. We saw it kind of more sneaky-like come back into vogue. You started seeing a lot of modern perfumers start to call things fruity sheep or this sheep or that sheep. A popular modern example would be Creta Ventus. And yeah, it does have a sliver of real oak moss in it, what's allowable. And then it has labdanum in it. It does use synthetic ambergris accord in it. And by definition, technically by definition, even though a lot of y'all hate Aventus, I know a lot of y'all hate it, but it does qualify. It does qualify. Another one is Emporio Armani C. The original C also qualifies. So there are a few other more recent examples that are doing the same thing. And for the most part, though, the sheep is not returning to the high street. It's returning to the upper echelon of the perfume world, the niche brands, the luxury exclusive lines of designers. We're not ever going to get a drugstore sheep ever again, because the person buying that fragrance doesn't have a care in the world about that anyway. That's a done, gone thing. So to circle back, what makes a sheep versus what makes a fougere is a fougere is this very aromatic, fern-like accord. The sheep is in essence just taking something that's supposed to resemble that coastal, windswept island vibe of the island of Cyprus with the labdanum and the salty air come off the Mediterranean Ocean, all that stuff. You're taking that general vibe and you're making a fragrance from that vibe, and then you're taking that fragrance, turning that fragrance into a ready-made base, if you will, to build another fragrance on top of that fragrance. So then you get the sheep, then you get the aromatic sheep, you get the floral, you get the you see where I'm going with this, the leather. So the genre has many branching splinters in many directions, and it's one of the reasons why there are a lot of vintage perfume fans who love the genre, since the genre in and of itself can be a whole world of perfume options. You can really spend your entire fragrance journey inside the sheep genre and never leave it and be perfectly happy. You'll have a sweet thing, you'll have a dry thing, you'll have a salty thing, you'll have a fresh thing, you'll have a spicy thing. You'll have so many different things to choose from without ever leaving the safety of the genre. You may not need to explore others. Problem is, most of those options are going to be vintage and or discontinued now. See, that's the thing, is when you become a fan of the sheep, you in essence become a fan of the old. You become a fan of the vintage, since the genre's best days are arguably behind it. And that's sad. The fougere still has a bright future, since the fougere itself was never materials heavy, so to speak. It was more accord heavy. The sheep is very much materials heavy, and if you could do a very good job of replacing those materials and squeak it by, a good example would be Synthetic Jungle by Frederick Malle. Kind of gets the job done of being a sheep without having any of the no stuff in it. So if you're good enough that you can do that, there may still yet be a bright future, but again, we're talking very high-end fragrances, hundreds of dollars. So it's just going to become an increasingly niche genre, which is kind of sad but also funny, since this was a genre that once dominated French perfumery so much. It was such a large part of the fragrance landscape, and now it's been reduced to like a tiny corner due to materials and regulations and other extraneous circumstances. It's just time marches on, right? Either you stay behind or you keep moving. And the sheep has had trouble moving, so it's been mostly staying behind. Alrighty, you know what the sheep is now. Go have fun, and this has been the On List.